Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of our Philosophy in Motion interview series. Today, we are thrilled and honored to have Jennifer Scuro joining us today from Molloy University. Hello, thank you. Thank you for joining.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Jen, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? What do you enjoy? As you asked me earlier, what brings you joy?
I could start there, right? Yeah, I'll work backwards. So I am right now an associate professor of philosophy at Molloy University, and I grew up in New York. I have slowly made my way through philosophy as a field, as a profession. I've published a couple of books. One was my academic book on addressing ableism. And that book was a work of love because it was coming out of kind of thinking through the problem of bias, and which was a lot of what I did from my first days as a young academic in philosophy, of thinking through how bias is a harm and what kind of violence comes from ableism. If I were to pitch the book, the real diamond in the book is a dialogue between me, Devanya Havis, and Lydia Brown on intersectionality and how ableism is could be considered like racism or sexism or other kinds of isms, and yet is not any of those things. But a really wonderful conversation, kind of as the delicious center of the book. And then in 2017, I also published another book. Do not recommend. Do not publish two books in one year.
Oh, I thought you meant
Kind
the
of
book. I'm like,
accidental.
why are you? We don't have to talk about the book if you don't want to recommend it. No, you don't
Dude,
recommend.
no, absolutely recommend. The scholarly book came out in I believe it was late 2017, early 2017. Did a graphic novel that is also sandwiched with a philosophical analysis of pregnancy loss, which was also a work of love and a kind of different part of myself. So my undergrad degree is a Bachelor in Fine Arts, so I've always been a painter, a sculptor, a visual artist. But I did not want to teach art, so I decided to go to grad school in philosophy. I was not as good a philosopher as I was an artist, but I did not want to teach people what was a resource for me. It was too private and it was not translatable. But philosophy, I could have anybody in my classroom and give them the things that I found exciting and wonderful. So I finished my degree, I think, in like 2005. My dissertation work was on Levinas and post-Holocaust ethics, um, and imagining an ethical writing of history. I think when people talk about, history's written by the winners, to some effect, I was um, really I felt an urgency to challenge that. And in current times, I feel all the more um, that urgency that I felt then, still now. That the idea of a world we live in having such a non-philosophical interest in kind of how we live, what is valuable, an open spirit of creative debate and discussion. So I do feel like the work I'm working on now and the research direction I'm in is on the intersection of disability and trauma. So right now, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to de-psychologize trauma studies. I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is kind of reclaiming it from the Bessel van der Kolk model of the body keeps the score. Valuable as it is in trauma studies and trauma discourse, I think there's a missing kind of epistemology. So I think maybe May, I might be giving the beginning of like a talk about can trauma be archived? So that's right now what has been in the background interesting to me, but also kind of cataloging ways in which trauma informs one's life. It is a form of knowing. The survivorship is a form of knowing, and not simply kind of the therapeutic goals that come with trauma survivorship, or, in some ways to politicize trauma as a condition, similar to disability, where a lot of times I think at least critical disability studies has worked very hard to recontextualize disability is not a personal thing that gets riveted to one in terms of their identity, although it's important to identify as disabled when one's disabled because so much of the context has been as if it were a failing or a deficit. I think trauma too is been when people go through things that are life-threatening and complex and um, I don't know if we do enough to see that as a site of new knowledge and a new kind of catalog of labor. And we need to politicize it. How are we putting people who have already been traumatized in over and over again conditions that will re-traumatize them? How much responsibility do we take for conditions that are trauma inducing or trauma amplifying? So that's right now academically giving me life. And then in the background, me doing the work of teaching and really enjoying that work. Getting back into the classroom for a while there. I had not been working as an educator, and especially around times of COVID. So being able to restore some of that, um, kind of finding my place in the world and doing the work of the classroom, creating really good learning opportunities for like the work of philosophy. So yeah, that's where I am right now, and that's, kind of a little outline of the background.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing your whole life world there for,
Yeah.
for us. Thank you. But for those who are just now tuning in and we're not there for our private conversation, which is everybody, we are kindred husserl spirits, Jen and I. So I had to throw that in there. I want to come back to the graphic novel and your books to get those names, but what you just landed on is such a wonderful transition moment to go into this interview. So I want to put a pin on the graphic novel, come back to that.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd like to know how it is you would describe your highest advantage, however it is you might be interpreting that word
Mm.
or term.
So I think we've and in our pre-discussion and pre-interview discussion, I think I had the concept of advantageousness, the idea of advantage is interesting because don't I don't think I've always thought of anything I've done in the language of advantage, in the sense of a kind of progress. I grew up where productivity gave you value. If you were productive, you were valuable. Um, and I was well suited, or sometimes I even say well groomed, for better or worse, to be very productive. Beauvoir's dutiful daughter, in the sense of I did what was expected of me. I, with some resistance as appropriate, but I was always thinking about um, a very ambitious challenge to myself that whenever I was posed with something that intrigued me that I did not do well, I dropped everything and became really good at it. So it was from small things to I always wanted to I think at one point wanted to make macarons because they looked so complicated. And I'm like, I'm just going to learn how to make them. And I made so many. They were all terrible until they weren't. And then they were amazing. And then people requested them. And I said, oh, I'm not making them anymore. Because as soon as I conquered that skill, I moved on to the next thing. Oh, I think that would be fascinating if I could do this. And then suddenly just building a whole new skill set or a whole new. But I always worked with that as both an ambition and then this kind of productivity that would come after it. Um, Being a little long in the tooth now, being a little bit of an old lady, I do think I've learned to keep an eye out for the way in which I burn myself out. So I think that's where the advantageousness is also. I'm very cautious because I I think the narrowness or the kind of manufacture of challenge sometimes would drain me, and um, you risk, that kind of time in which you have too many eggs in a basket, too much hope and will and energy put in something that was falling apart. And so I think when I think of my highest advantages, learning how to love how I am when it comes to being fascinated, fixated, being able to always willing to play the kind of fool, like I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna figure this out. I want to do this, and modeling it for my kids. Always thinking like this is the way I parent, this is the way I teach. I model it. I'm not proselytizing that anybody like take this life as a example of what one should do, but that I find ways to redeem things that I learn, even when I am really bad at it, as kind of a affirmation. Learn like the idea that being messy, being curious, being failed is still life affirming activity. And it is a counter narrative to what I grew up with, which was you are productive, you are producing, and you do it with a smile. And so I think that's where I have found something very advantageous about being who I am and being more true to who I am, even though um, I think I grew up adapting to the environment I was in, even though that adaptation wasn't good for me, it could have been dangerous. And there were times in which it was really dangerous. It was life-threatening to be so productive. And that's also where the work of ableism and the work that I did with that book was really important for myself because it was a kind of self-critique of my own internalized ableism, that being able-bodied was the only way I could validate myself. Um, and as time went on and as I took care of disabled people in my life and took care of myself as I became disabled, um, was again maybe part the academic part of me, but I think also just that disposition to constantly um, take on challenges in a non-manufactured way to to find the way to make it make sense so that it becomes useful, it becomes powerful, it becomes validating, independent of external forces. So it meant something to me, and then it kept me fueled, that I was able to be my own resource in being able to do something that wasn't manufactured crisis or was not manufactured um, challenge. So again, does making macarons translate when it comes to kind of keeping myself alive when I was, at one point during COVID, I was unemployed, I was not working, I was, um, as many of us were, kind of like at the base level of like what it means to survive something. And I think it was very similar strategy. Okay, like I'm going to learn how to make a macaron. I'm going to learn how to survive this. I'm going to figure out what I need and then become a resource to others and as I am for myself as best I could. But yeah, that's I think when I think of advantageousness, it is really this always coming back to something that I remember from Levinas. Um, the best thing about philosophy is that it fails. It's always kind of that language that kept me going. And that was from my a friend of mine, Devanya Havis, was the one that pointed that one out in Levinas, and so I carry that with me at least in spirit.
Yeah. Without putting you on the spot and potentially traumatizing you further, can you say more about this discovering of disability, and how this discovery impacted your life affirming direction, as
Mm.
opposed to this production direction. Well, we need to move away from that direction. So what about this path of discovery? Uh, yeah, what about this path of discovery goes in hand with this move towards something that is life affirming
Mm.
or just productive?
Yeah. I One of the things I think that and I don't think it's so much a direct like a diagnostic account of disability or a clear moment in which it was here I am disabled. Um, I had worked my oldest daughter is autistic and um, part of the book was going into disability communities, going to the Society for Disability Studies, making myself literate in the field of critical disability theory as a parent. That was one of the ways in which I started kind of that evolution. And and I narrate some of that in my book. But as time had gone on and my own life circumstances, I think it became more clear to me that I had to grapple with what I was dealing with as I have, as I am embodied, as I have a lived body. As I got older, I was very unwell. I do talk a little bit about this in different places. I haven't done much publication wise, but around the time of, I think it was right before COVID. Needed a hysterectomy. I was very unwell. I was basically hemorrhaging all the time, and it was very difficult to like function. I had at that point not only lost my job, but I had been anemic. I had had a lot of my pregnancy losses were also around a lot of heavy bleeding. So there was a lot of trauma around that from my reproductive history. And then of course my reproductive history comes back to challenge me. And uh I went seeking the hysterectomy. And again, around the time of COVID, it would have looked like uh, a chosen surgery. It would look like I was just seeking it out for comfort or quality of life. And I was told by the my doctor at the time that she wouldn't do it, that I could like medically induce menopause or something like that. But I'm glad I kind of stuck it out because what had happened was once I had my hysterectomy, they discovered cancerous polyp. Thank goodness it was removed with the hysterectomy. And I had a kind of procedure where it wasn't going to create any long-term impact. Um, and so one of the things I thought to myself was um, the the ability and I can't say enough the degree of psychological crisis, the anxiety, the depression. I was seeking out a lot of other kind of therapeutics to just be able to feel I could do everything. And I was also a parent. I also had to maintain a lot of other like responsibilities. And yeah, I once that took place and I was able to reflect on it, I realized that those quality of life care was life-saving care. And so I did everything I could to take those experiences where my body was, fully disabled to really remind myself that whatever disability means, it can't be personal. It can't, it has to be political and it has to be contextual in the sense of community. I think the idea of building a catalog of knowledge around what it is to have a disability. I talk about it in my book as like, what are the prosthetic effects? What do I need that will keep me going? So I had a small set of friends from grad school that we would check in with each other every week as they went through their journey and they struggled with certain things. Again, one of the things I have written about was I wish we wouldn't have gone back to normal after COVID. I think one of the things we learned was, in some ways, everybody knew what it was to be disabled, to not be able to leave your home, to be always under threat of further illness, um, to be to not know how to build resources around yourself or how to take care of the people that you love with very little kind of social infrastructure to intervene. So the going back to normal has always been an issue. But I think that's also where I kind of found that I had language, and also had that kind of catalog of materials to come back to. So there's one book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah Lakshmi Pipesina Samarsina, and they talk about crip emotional intelligence. You know, this idea of like knowing not what you need because you want to be able-bodied, but knowing what you need so that you can then exchange it for what you have with others who also need. And that you could build that kind of understanding that when you have competing needs or competing issues of accessibility or concern, like that's not something that will make everybody worse. That competing accessibility needs, competing, you know, real-time needs, that disabled folk took really good care of each other when they were given the license to do that. Or again, whatever resources they could find, making that then a kind of oasis of relief from a world that is horrendously able-bodied and always kind of validating who's functional over, what dysfunction might mean. And that, when you talk to people in real time about that, everybody's got that level of, you know, fear or experience over what it is to not function and also feel invalid. So I think, yeah, disability, the relationship with disability, me personally, has been varied. But I think when it comes to like the work I'm doing now, I'm thinking a lot about that question of um, how the relationship between disability and trauma can be really a kind of depersonalizing of the question of disability as an identity, but really kind of how, whether it be from trauma and one becomes disabled because of experiences or things that injure or alter one's ability to function in the world, but also like how a lot of disabled folk can traumatize each other because of how much it becomes a personal thing and not a way to build community. There's no hooks, there's no ways to kind of organically create systems of resource that are local, that are properly prosthetic, that could be corrected in real time. If a lot of disabled folk rely on a healthcare system that will always medicalize their disability, how much do we really then just continue to rely on that infrastructure for then what has prosthetic effect? What really feels like it helps and extends us and gives us new access to the world, and what doesn't, you know? So the prosthetic effect thing has been really interesting too. I've been talking a lot about like tools and what kind of tools, but relationships can be tools, environments can be tools, and some things have that process, and sometimes they need to be tailored. My eyeglasses, if they're not updated prescription, it's as much as it works, it can stop working. And if I don't get that lens corrected, this is just a artifact. It's just a thing among things. And so a lot of people fill their life with a lot of artifacts and a lot of tools, but those tools are mass produced. Those tools are generic. Those tools are like for anybody. But I think prosthetics or thinking prosthetically means that the world is accessible. And when it is not accessible, that we find ways to adapt it, reformulate it, exchange it, be able to retool it, correct it.
And to have the wrong tool, or at least an ill-fitting one with the glasses example, it could do more harm than good. I had gone to the eye doctor for the first time in years this summer. Come to find out, my lenses were 100 points off. I'm now severely nearsighted, and I got a blessed hat for how much I could had contributed to that the degradation by having. Yeah, I had glasses. Yeah, I had contacts. They were slightly off, but that even that put strain on the eyes.
Right,
Um,
right.
so I love that your experiences, you just seem so oriented to this greater life world. As I said, even when you were talking about your personal life, like, no, my experiences are not personal, and you're tying it back into environment, to social context, to community itself, and healthy organic ways of affirming each other.
Mhm.
um, this moves right into our next question. Does that personal highest advantage connect to a universal or maybe common notion of humanity? And maybe
Mm.
to add a little contextual flavor here, what might you say about the medicalization of uh, whether it be disability or just your different way of being in the world that's now medicalized?
Mm.
How do those go hand in hand?
Well, I think this is where, as time has gone on, the work on ableism and disability has moved toward this question of trauma, because I think there was, for me, a deeper humanizing problem when it came to that territorialization of what it is to have a body, what it is to be in the world. Again, being kindred, um, phenomenologists in the best sense of it. I think the concept of harm and violence, the ways in which we are, um, the plasticity that's possible, that comes with that kind of, um, at least understanding trauma as a potential for a kind of epistemology rather than psychology or therapeutics, that we don't want to fix what trauma does. And we definitely don't want to silence what trauma is when trauma is experienced or trauma becomes embodied, built into the body. And so I think when I'm thinking about medicine, especially having had medical trauma, the graphic novel, coming back to that, is a kind of archive of that trauma. And from start to finish, it really was this idea of like my pregnancies and my pregnancy losses being the doctor looking at me through the doctor's tools, through this idea of giving birth as the goal, right? The having a baby was the only thing, even though my body was doing all kinds of things that were indicating, to some degree, really natural and appropriate things for my body. Um, but always feeling like that was a failure, feeling like I was failing. And that the poverty of language, other than medical language around having a baby or being pregnant or trying again, which was devastating, um, because it covered up a lot of what was missing from me being able to keep going and really feel like there was like was being pregnant like a disability? Uh, was it the same as a disability? There were times in which it was really fully impairing, because of how grief-stricken I was about what I was going through. My body actually had, this was a story, I don't know, I don't always tell the story, but one of the things that was really so interesting was how when I had a pregnancy loss, what the date was that I would have had the baby, my body went into a full autoimmune skin reaction. And I had completely disconnected it. And it was only my husband who had turned around and goes, "Well, wasn't this supposed to be the original due date?" Because it was like one of those kind of like, I would have never thought my body had been scripting itself out. And I kind of reconnected that moment in like, yeah, my body's still recording. My body's still, even though I've completely, kind of took myself out of that in a kind of escape, a kind of flight from that part of what had happened because grief really, that was my only coping strategy. And then the very end was that moment where I finally did have another child, and I was having a C-section, and I was having a tubal ligation. So I was like, I don't have to ever be questioning pregnancy. I don't want to do this again ever. And the doctor's over me, he turned around as I am, because I had had a C-section, so I'm in this surgical position. And he turned and he goes, "Oh, I'm only doing the one ovary, right?" And in my head, I panicked. I thought, did I not communicate? Did I not tell them? Like, what do they do? And they started laughing. So they had told a joke over my open abdomen that they thought, so that was and I always said, when you write a graphic novel about pregnancy loss, you don't really, there's no happy ending with having the baby. But of course there's not, because I couldn't have just a baby. I had to have that joke told over me, over my exposed. So medicine has not been trustworthy when it comes to kind of what it is to be cared for, what it is to be free of those kinds of trauma inductions, right? To be trauma induced, um, exacerbating those things that I'm sensitive about. And being able to go back to a doctor, even when I was seeking the hysterectomy, was so difficult because a lot of times it was all that same physical scripting of doing an ultrasound, sitting there trying to explain to a doctor why I can't do certain procedures because of my history. So there's all these ways in which I think the trauma experience and trying to honor my limitations is not possible in a medicalized way when it comes to the stuff that's like not quite sickness and illness, not quite disorder, and not quite disability. So I think that's also where trauma, or how trauma, we might talk about trauma, has been really so important for me right now.
This is ringing really true to me. I have ulcerative colitis. I don't have extreme ulcer. It's mild. Even in its mild form, it's very painful.
Mm.
I'm exhausted, and working remotely has been very helpful. Having that diagnosis was life-changing because now I can advocate for myself. Um, and when I'm seeing a new doctor, I can have that in my back pocket if they start to say some of the things that you're experiencing are your fault. That which happened recently. I'm like, oh
Mhm.
gosh,
I believe it. I believe it.
thank God I have my GI that I do. But it took like 13, 14, 15 years to figure this out, and to all the trauma of
Mm.
being blamed for my symptoms, for saying I'm hysterical, it's not that bad, or whatever, this, that, and the other, to finally have that diagnosis. On the
Yeah.
one hand, uh, I wear it as a badge. Yes, I have ulcerative colitis, and you need to talk to me differently, or else we're going to end up in court.
Hmm. Hmm.
However, I don't want to think of myself as sick. Uh, yes, my bowels bleed, but so much of it is stress brought on from childhood trauma and traumas that just keep, you know, it's an autoimmune response to this constant hypervigilant state that I'm in. You know, am I an issue in nature? No, but in terms of capitalism and my productivity that you brought up
Hmm.
earlier, oh, now I'm a problem. So by
Hmm.
taking on this diagnosis, I'm on the one hand advocating for myself, but on the other hand, undermining all that I bring to this world. I don't have to be a manual laborer, or to be able to produce, volumes of work a month in order to contribute in a healthy way to this world. You know, so what you're saying, kindred spirits, we are kindred spirits.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It is. And again, where is the rehumanization that has to be put into place? It is a kind of labor to rehumanize ourselves after we've gained something from medicine, because I think with every gain, there is this kind of also, kind of cover up to what could be possible. Thinking phenomenologically, thinking existentially. And it really is. that kind of paradoxical quality of, I do have a whole chapter on diagnosis in the ableism book, where it is this the loss of the dialectical in diagnosis that becomes very dangerous. And a lot of medical practitioners have been taught to be, you know, accurate, quick, their training has always been to kind of get it and then move on. I've done my part. Here are the prognostications you get from me as it is in the book, right? So, but that dialectical quality of kind of like you have this, but maybe also there are these factors, or maybe we need to do more tests because maybe there's something I'm missing. You don't see that differential, evaluation in a lot of those relationships, except when you have somebody that you know or who knows you and is already kind of banked that history. When you mentioned about your GI who knows you, Mia Mingus talks about access intimacy and how important that is, that when you have somebody or when you have people who know what it is that you need, then when something fails, when something's not working, when the prosthetic needs a correction, it's easy because then you have people who know and people who know what might you need next, right? You don't have to do all the work of starting over, starting fresh and having to explain, right? Because again, the labor of having to like even fill out the paperwork is exhausting if you have to be doing it every single time. If there is no access intimacy, the amount of exhaustion and the amount of labor and the amount of like just sheer system failure is more. We've made it more possible for me to become unable to advocate, even with a diagnosis, because of how much we get riveted or reduced to that diagnosis. And fight, flight, fawn, freeze, right? I think that's what you do see, is that you're just encouraging people to be on that hypervigilance. The Levinasian ethics has always been the hardest part because that has been Levinas, is that hypervigilance is it's a very exhausting, demanding ethics, which is also why I love it, because it also is honest. In some ways, what other option is there except that kind of vigilance for the what is other? Because once we lose that attention, once we lose that demand, we do there is this kind of reduction of existence. I just wrote this piece recently for my friend's art catalog. Lucy O'Donnell had done a art show in Ireland, um, our little earthbound things, I think she called it. I don't have the catalog with me, but I wrote a piece on Levinas's Ilia. And um, for those who don't know, Levinas talks about this idea of like the dull hum of existence, the ilia, the there-ness of existence without a face, and how there is something so cruel about it, so undoing about it. And I think that's all the ways in which sometimes we get reduced down to just being a body. And we lose that idea that each one of us is, again, that idea of that connection to the other through what Levinas would call the face, or this like, face-to-face relation. That's also where I think medicine sometimes, for capitalism, for profit, meaning we become bodies, we become just numbers, we become calculations and quantifications, and honestly it's full of eugenic, genocidal language. It really is, you know, um, dehumanizing the system of care that we have in place in the US, especially because of it's so market driven and it's so shareholder. It creates crisis everywhere and unnecessarily. So yeah, the Ilia has always been that kind of concept of the kind of terror and horror of the kind of being reduced down where one does not have a face. One no longer, it's just a dull hum of existence.
Oh, does does that language that comes to suppress us even further through our institutions and our very means of communication? Um, is that an expression of a sort of cultural vibe, style, if you will? Or, I'm just wondering, how do we break free of this language? It seems very disadvantageous to
Yeah.
be stuck in this, at least for the most of us. Um, what is the source of this language? How do we
Mm.
burst through it? Do we have to use that language? Like, for example, when I'm advocating for myself, in order to overcome the situation it's created,
Mhm.
or am I further perpetuating that situation by using that language? I don't know.
I I don't know. It's a good question because I think this is where, I've written on the idea of like art is survival and the creative ways in which people who have had so little and there is no resource to create something that provides that option. And language is tough. I think my friend Devanya talks a little bit about this idea of an index. There are kinds of ways in which there is catalogs of knowledge that has also been archived and what that looks like or what that means to pull them out. And I always tell my students when it comes to the history of philosophy, please pirate away. People have. All the people who have been doing the history of philosophy have been pirates. They've been pirating it in whatever way and whatever purpose they like with their training and their translation and their own agenda. And they have been able to pull from that history to their advantage, right? To kind of read it whatever way they want to. When it comes to reading the history of philosophy, I think that's also where there's language that's been there. I think it might need to be repurposed. I think we need to be a bit crafty, like in a Martha Stewart sense, maybe possibly criminal. I don't know. I'm game. I'm open to that. Subversive language use. Um, you know, as it what is it? Off label usage. I'm a fan. I'm a fan. I think my daughter always did that too. My older daughter, who's autistic, she would always do something that you think it had a function and it had a way to do it, and she'd suddenly pick it up and do it in a way that you're like, I don't think it was intended for that, but she'd do it in a way that was completely, I'll give an example. She played Minecraft for a while there. And Minecraft is great. I went in and played Minecraft to see what it was like. And it was like an old-fashioned colonial, like let's take the dirt and mine the dirt and build a house and like very old school kind of idea of like world building.
Okay.
And um, and I had no idea there was creative mode. There's only survival mode that I knew. And then she gets on, she's in creative mode. I didn't even know that was an option. And she's flying and she's doing all this stuff. And then you can spawn things. You can make an egg and then you could create a creature, but you can like dump a whole bunch of eggs and then you create all these creatures. So you can make a farm and you can do it right. So there's also like zombies and all these other kinds of awful creatures that are, terrible skeletons and whatnot. And I'm totally shortcutting the wonderful weirdness of Minecraft. And I was in the other room and I just remember listening to this noise coming from the television that was like horrifying. It was just cacophonous, horrifying noise. I come in and she had spawned zombies and skeletons and everything in the like smallest, they all like these squares, these like um in that little square so many different of all the icky creatures, all the just, and they were all screaming and making these awful noises. I'm like, what are you doing? She goes, I am having a zombie party. And I'm like, she was so enjoying herself. What it sounded like was horror, but for her, this is how she played this game. That was her jam. So I do think when it comes to language, the um the fixity or the fix is in when it is co-opted for utility, for functionality. In this, especially because we live in conditions, the neoliberal, profit deregulation model of economy. So I'm always a big fan of labor. I think when I come back to like a real important like baseline for me when it comes to how value works or what becomes valuable or what needs investment. I do think it's the question of labor and what it would take to open up possibilities, laboring for possibility rather than laboring to maintain status quo. You know, can language be in service to expedient labor, new forms of labor, and an appreciation of labor, emotional labor, psychological labor, the labor of a trauma survivor to be able to say what's happened in a way that is unspeakable, right? So I think that's what language has to be, is has to be, and that's why I love Lucy's work, because a lot of it is also out of pregnancy loss. And what she does is create this little catalog of imageries that are recycled images, but also show despair and show kind of this Unheimlichkeit, the uncanniness of, what would be cartoon or what would be kind of ease of accent. Like, oh, everybody knows what that is. And yet at the same time, it's like, what's happened? Like it becomes so confusing and disorienting in a very pointed and very moving way, which is why the piece I wrote was Ilya, because I kept thinking like she puts us up against the Ilya even when we think we're in safe, familiar, comforting territory. And that discomfort is, it really does get us to acknowledge that the despair that's right behind all of it, that's kind of underwriting a lot of our flight to reduce everything down to something accessible, simple, and ease with ease.
Yeah. Um, how do you think your everyday practical endeavors, and maybe we can focus this around art and this repurposing of language, how might that serve the achievement of your highest advantage?
That's a good question. It's tough. Yeah, I I think this is at the end of the day, I do think as an educator, it's always been that that conceptual location. Like I always give birth to new things in my pedagogy. Like it's teaching where I always feel like that's where I am the most creative and moving things onto a board, a chessboard, rather than always feeling like I'm moving the same set of pieces. I'm always like bringing new things onto the board for play, for gameplay. Um,
Zombie party.
and yeah, and so I do think that that's like part of my achievement is like to be, can you say master educator? I don't even know if that's even possible, but like in a Freirian sense of pedagogy of the oppressed, like at every turn, the problem posing that I do through my teaching, I think has been kind of an extension of that high achievement. Even though it's not directly art related, it is because of my art practices that I can then bring that kind of play, disorient, but also take the risk out of the disorientation in being able to kind of learn something unneeded, unnecessary, and suddenly it becomes urgent and absolutely necessary. I had to teach modern philosophy this semester, and I think it's not a quick sell for my colleagues to be like teaching. Modern does not, you can't dress that one up too easily. Um, and I did. I made them read Leibniz. I mean, how do you teach a philosopher again, talk about buried in the archive? And I'm like, you can read, well, Spinoza too. And having them get excited about, going to read something that seems so arcane and so bizarre, and then suddenly it poses a new problem that they have, that they're interested in, that wouldn't even had. And the play of that has been really great. It's been really lovely and organic and spontaneous to the spontaneity of that adaptation that they pick up and what it means to them has been, that's part of my advantageous achievement. It feels like an accomplishment to suddenly have a student, you know, argue something about lock and property, and it's like, what? All right, let's go.
So leading into our next question, do you think that that play, um, does that help us come to know the basic patterns of the mind or of human experience, or in this case of human history? What's your point of access to those patterns? Would you say that that play is integral, or are other forces at play?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've done a little on play theory. I think the idea of gaming has been also part of my teaching practice. It's been part of my art practice for a very long time. And again, the art practices are so privatized for me. So sometimes I'm at play in a way that is nonsensical. I could not translate it if I wanted to. Um, and I think with, especially with teaching, the, um, the nonsensical quality of learning is um is supposed to be joy because so many of my students come in and again I'll use the word groomed have been groomed to be productive and there's high risk on success models of productivity even if they're not bought into it especially if they're doing it because that's what they've inherited as an expectation um I think I have always re-narrated what is expected as an outcome, as opposed to um, accepting what is without outcome. Like, what happens if we do this? What happens if we test this? What happens? And giving a lot of free choice. I talk about my classroom as a buffet table. And I'm kind of like the cruise director, and I'm like, here, listen, there'll be cheese. If you don't like cheese, don't eat the cheese. If you want to try a new cheese, try some cheese. Do not eat the whole cheese. Like, don't do that. It's bad for you. There'll be chicken franchise coming up. You'll get to the entrees. And of course, you cannot scoop up the entrees like the cheese with your hand. I will give you some utensils to get to the entree. So please don't read Leibniz by yourself. Please, I will give you some utensils to get to Leibniz. But in the meantime, let's start here with some, I think therefore I am Descartes. So as I move through and thinking about patterns, I do use like almost like a party model, like we're at a symposium, we're at a celebration. I talk about I double down on this metaphor, the whole thing. Again, growing up on Long Island, if you've ever been to a Long Island wedding, they are a lot. They are
Oh,
very highly ritualized, very over the top ceremonies. But even their group work, I'll say things like, I'm going to put you into cohorts, kind of like when you're seated at a table with people you don't know at a wedding, and you can work with them if it happens to be that the person that you're in the group with, you kind of bond, then work with them. It makes the party fun. If someone never shows up to the seat, no harm, no foul, have a good time. Like, so even the concept of group activity or group interaction has always been really something I had to like retell the story. For them, group work is preparing them for work world, for professional life. And they don't like it because it's always this competition. That person didn't do their work. That person didn't show up. That person didn't, I have to do all the work now. So group work is always this kind of very insincere exercise of interaction. Um, the cohort model has been kind of like you come to the party, you can have fun with or without those who are around you. Sometimes it's more fun because there are others around you who want to play with you, who want to, who it's fun to get to know. Maybe they are really different and they play differently and they work differently. So I always encourage partnerships and I encourage peer reviewing that is contented. So they always are working for a peer audience. They write a paper, they write for themselves, and they write to others. Imagine peer audience. I said, please don't write a paper to me as if I'm your only reader. And it takes off a lot of the veil of the grooming that they've been through of like that it's performative. So getting rid of the performance uh, in a lot of what it is to learn, that you can do it or fake it till you make it. Those are the things that I think in my pedagogy are patterns that I'm kind of, kind of steering away from or kind of making less structurally built into the work than like kind of I don't know, go your own way. Like what's up with this? What is intriguing to you? What is investment for you? As it may not have any other purpose except just you're like really kind of like curious. It's just this weird and interesting thing. I think I must have said Leibniz was weird 100 times in that class. It's so weird. Why read it? Why read it? Except maybe this is the best of all possible worlds. What do you think? You know?
Oh, I don't even have to ask the last question of how you make use of those patterns in your everyday practical endeavors.
Yeah.
Um, what I loved is that you recognize all these patterns that are at play. We can step away from these hegemonic forces and engage in other patterns. And just
Mhm.
through that engagement, we reveal the world on a completely new level, and are able to relate the history of philosophy into our everyday affairs. I love that so much. I'm a big fan.
It's not always effective either. Always keeping it humble with, you know, the failure rate is always part of the learning curve too. It does not have to be a win. It can sometimes really be just very loving in that whatever we're doing, the labor is itself the value. So always appreciating my students' labor as they're laboring and feeling like that there isn't necessarily a prize at the end or a reward intrinsically in just the doing of it, but just simply allowing it to be um, a reclaiming of time from those things that have the carrot kind of dangling in front of them. That it's always about the, you know, getting to the grade or to the, you know, checking the box or whatever. I think that's also what's really nice is that, you know, very old Kantian idea of the purposefulness of the purposelessness, right? The purposeless is got this own kind of meaningful thing is that we do something non-teleological. We do something that just kind of marinates. Let's sit. Experimentation is, I think, something that as a practice is very hard for students. Again, capitalism treats that as waste. It's a waste of your time. And so even getting that language to be something we can, you know, set aside. But so much they're so vigilant for wastefulness that they end up missing the idea that like most of the best stuff is shit. The that's fuel in an ecological sense, right? The stuff that is the poop can actually fuel and make fertile whole new ground. So like we need to like love the poop. Be happy with our leaky, organic, messy bodies that do
Yes.
weird things.
Yes.
Why not? Why not?
My goodness. Yes. I'm real comfortable in the poop. Um, I think that's a wonderful uh, attitude to take on as teachers who are groomed to look at their performance in a certain way. Grading is such a weight, but to think of it as, you know what? I'm just approaching my students' work that they are sharing with me. That takes some of the pressure off of it and brings a little bit more joy back into the craft, I think. So I see what you're doing over there and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Um, kind of a tangent. What do you think of AI and students submitting that? What I've noticed over the course of this school year is less straight up AI submission and more, here's a sentence clearly written by AI. Here's a sentence clearly written by. So I see them working it in ways I'm not as upset about.
Yeah.
But what does the introduction of AI into the classroom do for your morale, or
Mm.
how it is that you approach grading or the act of teaching?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of us that are struggling with that because some of that is a product of, again, like any tool, what's the prosthetic effect? When we do see students using AI as a kind of compensation, it does have a prosthetic effect. If I can do that, I can then check that box. I can satisfy this demand that's made on me. I think it has a lot of times to do with the lack of buy-in or the fear of failure, right? The fear of not being able to do something. So I've always told my students AI use for me, I'm actually quite neutral. Like I think it's a tool among tools. I think it has accessibility qualities to it. There's a lot of us that use it because we need it for access. And I think that is important. I think that's acknowledging a certain kind of importance to a technology that for some people, especially disabled people, can be needed, right? So what happens when it's produced for the masses or those who already have advantage, who then take further advantage of that tool? What happens when the disability gain becomes then the only goal is for the able-bodied people, right? For the people who don't need it as for a point of access or something. And I've helped with at least in terms of my own the school and university, I started saying, when students are thinking about AI or do remediation, when they've been caught using AI and using it in a way that's academically dishonest, that we frame it in a language of stewardship, that as much as you might be using it now, this can also sabotage in the future lots of ways in which we can error correct. And there's lots of subtle ways in which the error of AI or errors in AI can't be corrected because we can't even catch them. Um, I tell them a story about how I had gone on to AI to ask a question about services for my daughter, and the AI generated something that actually wasn't true. But honestly, it took it from some website. It looked true. And I only knew it wasn't true because I had already investigated it. But it came up on the AI as if this is something that was true. And I was very frustrated because I think somebody who didn't know or didn't have the wherewithal to be able to research it would have been taking that as true because the AI generated it in a way that looks very benign and very neutral. So I think if we think about the relationship between tools and prosthetics, like we said, an ill-fitting prosthetic can cause more harm. Um, so when a tool is ill-fitting or a tool operates without a mechanism of correction, it's the chainsaw versus the surgical scalpel. Do you want to take out the cancer with a scalpel or do you want to do it with a chainsaw? You're going to kill the patient, right? But you could save the patient and actually make them well again by knowing exactly what needs addressed and what needs to be corrected or redeemed and what needs to be salvaged and what doesn't. And again, the skill you need to be able to do that and finesse that is so important. Again, life-saving. So I do use the language of they will inherit the same tool. But at that point, the usage, the literacy that people will have, the inability to correct it, um, will be greater. Not right now, we're at the verge of being able to decide to what degree this tool will serve us and to what degree this tool will continue to exercise a kind of harm that we won't be able to remedy or address or even know like how bad it is until very much after the fact. And I think that's where I've been with it is kind of giving them the sense of like, I do say this a lot in my classes, your elders have kind of betrayed you. Your elders have betrayed you. I think we've given you things and somehow expected you to use them and to um we've groomed you to use them in a way that we think we expect you've internalized as an expectation and a function that I think is a bit of a ruse. I think it's going to sabotage. And I said, how many of you don't even know how to spell certain words because of spell check? I think it's like there's a loss in that ability to skillfully be able to help correct, self-correct, to reframe, to ask for help, all that stuff. Um, that I think AI is another example of that kind of loss of labor, loss of accepting certain kinds of labor, a diversity of labor, skill building, giving people the tools they need to be able to do for themselves what they see fit. I think AI could be something that could be a tool among tools, but I think it's been mass produced and there's a lot of money made and there's a lot of environmental damage being done that they will now be stuck with this and to steward it because their elders have betrayed them. Because because some people have become heroes for the way in which they think AI could save the planet or save themselves or save, I don't know. I think the Elon Musk thing has been very difficult because Elon Musk going into government systems of care full taxpayer systems, democratic systems that have been operating, no matter what the critique is of the system as such, to go in with a hack chainsaw,
A literal chainsaw.
a literal chainsaw, metaphorical, literal, and really, what are the people of Doge literate in? AI. It's technology that is it's destroying systems that then become life-threatening to people who are really the stakeholders of this equation.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I have a couple of times hinted about the concern that I have for my students over this kind of hero narrative of people who are very wealthy and in power. Those people who are wealthy and in power have been riding what has been, I think, the grooming that they've been told that this is the goal. This is a win. And yeah, I worry that we don't have archived enough or at least opened up the archive well enough so that when people need them, they can find all the other beautiful gifts of what people have been able to do in conditions of crisis and in conditions that are life-threatening to be able to find community and take care of themselves and to give each other shelter and nourishment and strength and joy. And I think that's also where I love the epistemology work that comes out of that. There's a few people who do trauma studies, feminist trauma studies, uh, uh, critical disability justice work that they also have these lovely. There's something called 10 Principles of Disability Justice. So if I were to leave everybody with that one last thing, if you were to think about AI in relation to the 10 principles of disability justice, I think that would be a nice way to re-narrate the crisis of AI or whatever it is, or whatever crisis it's going to cause into like a new framework that you can put it in its place. It can be put on the shelf if it's needed, or it can be activated because it serves a greater function for those who need it, right? And again, not depriving anybody and not being black and white about it. I think it's really any technology needs to be both in service, but also needs constant correction and retooling. And I think that can be very liberatory, especially when it's done in the hands of those who are in the best power, most creative. Like I find that sometimes those people who, what is that? The circumstance can be the master of invention. Wait, was that that, you know, I don't have anything, but I'm gonna the stone soup. I would just think of like I have like two or three things left in the cabinet, and now I can make a delicious meal. Like necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's it.
Oh, I'm so bad at quotes. I'm so bad at quotes. I
I'm
believe
not
you.
better. I'm not better. I think I found my way to it though.
Oh, well, before we leave, I wanted to circle back to that graphic novel and the other work that you mentioned, just so folks can look it up, and then we can advertise that as
Yeah.
well. What's the name of your work?
So the graphic novel is The Pregnancy Does Not Equal Childbearing Project, a phenomenology of miscarriage. And it's both the graphic novel and then in the second half of the book is really a phenomenology of miscarriage, grief work, this idea of what it is to grieve and how that works, and even the idea of using graphic narrative as an allegory, as almost like philosophical allegory. So that's the one book, and then my other book is Addressing Ableism.
Okay, awesome. I'll put that up there. Thank you so much, Jen, for joining us today. This has been an awesome interview. I know earlier I'm like,
Thank you
oh,
so
it
much.
won't last any more than an hour. I'm like, it's been
I think I did warn you. I was like, once we start talking, I can't wait to like chat about this. This is fun.
no,
Thank you so much.
yes, you're welcome and thank you. This has been fantastic, and I love that we've ended on joy and celebration. I think that's a radical act.
Yeah,
It's to be
yeah.
joyful and to come together in community, especially in times like these. I'm very appreciative of your view and you sharing with us.
Glad to be here.
So I will go ahead and stop recording. Goodbye, everyone.